Hello again. I'm Dan Alasso, and this is Making History. And today I have another chapter from my biography of Dr. Charles Knowlton, which I call An Infidel Body Snatcher and the Fruits of His Philosophy. And this is chapter 27, which is titled Prosecuted in Lowell. And it begins, as always, with a passage in Knowlton's own words. He said, "I had ample notice it was commenced, and with all ease might have evaded it. But I felt I ought to contend for my rights. It was brought in the name of a person wholly unknown to most of those to whom I inquired, and others informed me that he is an intemperate and worthless fellow. He was put in motion by a hypocritical, weathercock doctor of then orthodox pretensions, who has since left the place, the feelings of the people towards him being several degrees below zero." And now, my story. While he was standing trial in Taunton, Charles learned that charges had been filed against him in Lowell, Massachusetts. Lowell was a textile manufacturing city north of Boston, with a growing population of poor workers, many of them interested in Knowlton's message of self-determination and his practical advice on planning their families. Charles hadn't actually sold any books in Lowell, but he had circulated a prospectus describing the fruits of philosophy in detail. He petitioned the court, explaining that his trial in Taunton would soon be finished, and was allowed to give a $100 bond to delay his arraignment in Lowell. When he presented himself at the Lowell court, Charles learned that the criminal complaint against him was that he'd offered a copy of The Fruits of Philosophy to a local doctor to get his opinion of the book. Although the complaint didn't claim that he had sold even a single book, the judge set Charles's bail at $1,000. His bail was set so high, Charles said, quote, "evidently with a design and expectation, as I was a stranger in the place, of having me suffer much before trial." The judge set Knowlton's trial date for more than 3 months later, apparently hoping he would be unable to make bail and would suffer for quite a while before he was even tried. Luckily for Charles, he wasn't as much of a stranger in Lowell as the judge believed. Knowlton's supporters started a collection to free the victim of censorship. Thanks to the noble spirits of Lowell, Charles said, the judge soon found himself sorely disappointed in his attempt to jail the author of The Fruits of Philosophy before his trial. From the beginning of their struggle in Lowell, it was clear to Charles and his supporters they were fighting not only for reproductive freedom, but for the freedom of the press. The editorial pages of free thought papers all over the Northeast began to carry news of Knowlton's trial. Since most freethinkers were also agitators for workers' rights, many papers were quick to identify the suppression of the Fruits of Philosophy as another battle in the ongoing class war between the rich and the poor. "Who has Dr. Knowlton injured?" asked one editor. "No one. Is his book an obscene book? It is not even pretended. We might pronounce almost every medical work obscene with the same degree of propriety. What then has he done? He has made the knowledge too cheap. And that is not the worst of it. He has permitted common people, people who can be benefited by the knowledge, to have access to it. It will spoil the trade of the great and the rich. Poor people will not raise so many children to be slaves of their more wealthy neighbors, when they know that they can limit their number to suit their own circumstances without denying themselves any of the pleasures and enjoyments of a married state." Readers of these free thought papers, and unlike today, in the early 19th century, there were dozens of free thought papers and thousands of readers. They got the point and responded. The Fruits of Philosophy, one letter to the editor declared, was designed to save young people, and particularly the female sex, so that they need not be afraid to marry on account of poverty in the first place, and they need not be burdened with more children than they can comfortably support and educate in the second. In addition to book orders, Charles started receiving occasional cash donations from friends of liberty of opinion and of the press. By prosecuting its author, his enemies were publicizing the fruits of philosophy more extensively than Charles could ever have afforded to do. Charles received a transcript from a Free Thought Society in Pittsburgh that had met and passed, quote, sundry resolves expressive of their just and utter detestation of all foul and coercive measures to muzzle the press and to suppress the diffusion of scientific knowledge of practical utility, and also expressive of their favorable opinion of him as a man of science and a philanthropist, and of their intention to use their influence to make his writings known in the Western country. Unfortunately, the opinions of freethinkers couldn't quickly turn the tide of public prejudice or redirect court decisions, even in the early 19th century, when freethinkers were much more visible and vocal in American society than they are today. Knowlton's trial was held at the criminal court in Cambridge, 100 miles from his home in Ashfield. Charles hired a local lawyer named Mann, who advised him to plead guilty. Guilty of what? Charles asked. Why, guilty of selling the book, said Mann. Charles objected that he hadn't actually sold a book in Lowell when he was indicted, but that, quote, I had just as lief plead guilty of selling or publishing that book as if it were the Bible or any other book. What I contend for is that it is a good book, and such as I have a right to publish. As he had in his Worcester body snatching trial, Charles wanted to discuss the bigger issue, his right to publish and sell the fruits of philosophy, not the charge that he had. All that, answered the lawyer, can just as well be pled afterwards. Charles was surprised by Mann's advice, but, quote, understood him as if he had said, you will stand the same chance to be acquitted to plead this afterwards. He entered a plea of guilty and discovered he was not going to be allowed to argue for the legality of the book. The trial was over. Charles was found guilty of selling Fruits of Philosophy in Lowell, just as he'd been convicted in Taunton. But this time, Knowlton was sentenced to 3 months in prison and hard labor. Whether this last was designed as a punishment or as favor, Charles said, I do not know. But being of a rather slender constitution and for years subject to some disease of the heart, I could have dispensed with this part of the sentence very cheerfully. So that's the end of chapter 27. Charles has been tricked into pleading guilty of selling a book in Lowell that he didn't sell and has been sentenced. In the next chapter, he will serve that sentence. But that's all for now. So I hope you found that a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for listening. I will see you again.